Okay, so hopefully that stays. All right, today we're going to be actually now we're going to start to look at more specifically the different styles from around the world, and then when we go next door, we're going to play and do different styles. So we're going to start with the kicking arts. And so when we say this, like obviously, like Taekwondo, we punch in Taekwondo. We don't just kick in Taekwondo or whatever. And Muay Thai is very famous for example, elbows. That is as we'll talk about, another important aspect of that. Okay, so these styles. It's not to say that they don't have other aspects or whatever, but we're looking at, hey guys, glad you made me come on in. So it's not to say that they are exclusively kicking or punching or whatever. It's just, what is probably the more predominant aspect of it, okay? And so we're going to start with Taekwondo because that's one of the martial arts that we do here. And some of you guys either are in or maybe it might, who knows, end up in Taekwondo, and we're going to cover a little bit more of the history of that beyond, but we'll put a little more focus on Chungukwan Taekwondo, which is our style of school in here. Taekwondo is a Korean martial art, arguably the most popular in the world in 190 countries, so popular that it became a regular sport in the Olympics in the year 2000, and if you look at the history of Taekwondo, there are two very different types of history. And so in studying this, we're looking at other Korean martial arts where we see the same phenomenon elsewhere as well. But the discrepancy in the history is kind of telling about the history in general of the country and things like that. Okay? Many will claim that it is 4,000 years old, that it can be traced through ancient arts. One is called Subak, another one is called Taekyon. Okay? So there's Taekwondo, right? Then there is Taekyon. They might sound a lot alike, K-W-A-O-N, or K-W-O-N and K-Y-O-N, but from an etymological standpoint, they are nothing, there's no correlation, okay? One could argue that the person who named Taekwondo was pretty smart in making them sound similar, okay? And so, a lot of people will say, oh, Taekwondo kind of evolved from Taekyon. Taekyon is basically a folk game / martial art in Korea that your goal is to kick or trip or stomp the other person down. It's kind of like wrestling with your feet, kind of, sort of. Okay? And I say it's kind of a folk game. It would be done in festivals. It would be done, like I said, a lot of sweeps, a lot of trips, stomps, kicking, but again, kicking to maybe knock the other person down, right? And so it was played in festivals or, kind of like arm wrestling matches or wrestling matches here or whatever. That would be what they did. And then again, they were kind of turned into a martial art. And I guess the best way to describe it would be, there's a difference between like sandlot stickball, right? That a couple people get together and like Major League Baseball. I mean, the premise is the same, right? The level of sophistication is a little different, right? So, again, most people played it on a very folksy level, but it still could be taken to a much higher art form, if you will. Okay. Taekyon is arguably the indigenous, an original Korean martial art. Okay. However, despite what a lot of people say, there's very little evidence that Taekwondo came from originally came from, or there's a direct line of succession to Taekwondo. However, Taekwondo's emphasis on kicking, undoubtedly probably influenced a lot of the Korean martial arts today that are known for kicking. Right? Taekwondo, Aikido, a lot of our Korean martial arts have a lot of emphasis, have a lot of kicking in their curriculum. It's probably because of Taekwondo that it has that kicking influence became predominant. Okay, but again, there is the history that Taekwondo is thousands of years old. It was Taekwondo before. People will point to various archaeological, supposedly, evidence. There is, in Kumgang mountain range, they found like in one of our upper ranked black belt forms, this is called Kumgang Maki, right? One hand's blocking high, one hand's blocking low, or whatever, this way, right? And so supposedly in Kumgang mountain range, there's like a Buddhist guardian deity statue, and he's doing this or whatever, and it's ancient, and people are like, oh, see, everybody's doing the same pose like thousands of years ago. That's what we do in Taekwondo or whatever. Well, that deity in that pose is found around Asia. Usually, he's got a spear in his hands. I don't know what happened to the spear in this one. It rotted away. Someone stole it. They didn't have one, so they just made him empty-handed. I don't know, right? But so it's not a lot of evidence to sit there and say just because we do that and they do that. There's two murals in what is now North Korea or Manchuria that date back to early Korean, and they're like, oh, see, they're doing, they're pictures of people fighting. They're like, oh, see, they're doing Taekwondo. I mean, it's like guys in a fighting stance. What style is that? Just because he's standing with his hands up, because every martial art doesn't do that, right? So again, they're very nondescript. They're nothing definitive that you can say, oh, that's clearly right what's going on. Okay. Now, here, one of the points of issue with the Korean martial arts in particular was the Japanese occupation of Korea, starting around 1909, 1910, and leading up to World War II. Korea was part of the Japanese imperial, world war machine, etc. Okay, and as is customary, when you take over or occupy another force, you tend to limit their ability to, or resources to then rebel against you, right? That's kind of standard operating procedure, right? When we occupied Japan after World War II, we banned the martial arts so that people, again, couldn't practice. Now, actually, we could argue that was more on an ideological level because the martial arts was a way that people were militarized into, the way of thinking that they were modern day samurai, and they were ready to, kamikaze, they were ready to die for the emperor and stuff like that. So it wasn't so much that they were worried about the martial arts, people running around with samurai swords killing American soldiers that were controlling the area, so much as it was kind of calming down the war fervent that was going on in Japan at the time. But in Japan, basically eliminated or banned all martial arts practice in Korea. They did a lot more than that. There were a lot more atrocities that the Japanese government, the Japanese war machine did on the Korean part of the country, right? They basically impoverished the country, stealing a lot of stuff that's worth, weren't nice to the women, etc., things like that. So time heals a lot of wounds, but there's still, like, when we go to Korea, our hotel that we typically stay at is right across from the Japanese embassy, and there's still like a statue that's like a little Korean girl staring at, like basically a silent protest, right, to the atrocities that were going on there and stuff like that. So, but during this time, that also means there is a particular dark period in Korean martial arts history. And you would expect that to be so, right? So you, like, if it is illegal to do martial arts, right, because of your occupiers, you probably don't have a lot of like certificates and school records laying around. Because if you're discovered, oh look, all these people train with you, let's go round them up, right? That doesn't make it doesn't make any sense, right? So by nature of it supposedly having to go underground, things would be, you know, very clandestine. Things would be very again, there would not be a lot of records. There would, you know, not be a lot of information at that time. Okay? The problem is that allows for people to fill in the blanks and make stuff up a lot. Okay? Or again, conjecture about what was going on at that time that maybe really wasn't true. Because there was no record, there's no history to refute it. Okay? So it's kind of a double-edged sword there. Okay? So, again, there's a lot. Now, like for example, Taekyon, because of those things, basically nearly died out. There's only like a couple of grandmasters left after the war that, you know, the art basically nearly went extinct. And it is enjoying a revival today, not as a martial art, but almost as like a kind of a cultural heritage, right? Well, same reason, like I used the example before, people like to dress up in like Revolutionary War or do Ren fairs or whatever else, right? It's kind of the same thing. Maybe, you know, they just get in touch with their historical heritage and stuff for other purposes, right? Besides just, you know, martial arts or whatever, right? So Taekyon, some people are doing it for that reason, but it's still going on, okay? But like I said, there's this dark period in Korean history, and it's kind of weird. Now, during this time when the Japanese took over Korea, you also had a lot of expatriates. You had a lot of people that basically were either went into the Japanese military service or went to school in Japan. One such guy is Won-guk Lee, who is the founder of the Chungakwan. He went to study law in Japan. Okay? And while he was there, he studied Shotokan karate. Okay? With the founder of Shotokan, Gichin Funakoshi, and also his son. Okay? Went to Japan, studied Shotokan karate. He comes back after the war. And after the war is over, he comes back and he basically sets up shop and starts teaching what he did in Japan. Okay? Shoto means pine wave. It was Funakoshi's pin name, and it was given to him by his students. He talks about you know, being in the forest, hearing the wind go through the pines, and kind of the wave and the force, and that was an inspiration for his martial arts and stuff. So anyway, pine wave Shoto means pine wave. Okay, a tradition in martial arts is if you're going to set up shop, but maybe you're not the authentic teacher, is you keep part of your name so people kind of know, an aficionado, someone in the know would know kind of where you started from, but you also change the name because you're not necessarily doing the exact same thing as what your teachers are. You're not the official lineage holder of that style, right? So you change part of your name, you keep part of your name, so you pay homage to where you came from, but at the same time you don't misrepresent yourself, okay? So pine wave in Won-guk Lee changes to Chungdo. Instead of Shoto, he changes it to Chungdo, which is blue wave. Okay? So he changes pine wave to blue wave, and thus keeps part of it and changes part of it. Okay? But anyway, so history of Cheonggukwan is a good example of what happened in post-World War II Korea. People come from China, Japan, whatever, and there's this vacuum because people have not been doing martial arts there forever, right? And they start setting up shop and doing what they learned in China or Japan or whatever else, okay? And so there were other martial artists who did a similar thing, okay? And so Wanguk Lee sets up the Cheonggukwan, arguably the first and largest or most important of the Kwans that in early Korea, or early Taekwondo history after World War II, okay? And basically, it also then starts to then be influenced by kind of this whole, again, this Korean idea or notion of kicking, okay? And so you see at the beginning, like our forms that we learn in Taekwondo are really Shotokan forms, okay? The old school ones are, okay? The Cheonggukwan forms are basically Shotokan forms. But then you have a very different emphasis on kicking in the art and stuff like that. So Taekwondo has evolved into something a lot more unique as it became more Korean, right? And again, it's really a different martial art in itself. But there's this huge discrepancy in the history. Taekwondo is 4,000 years old. It's been called different things, but it's essentially the same thing, right? And it's gone on, and you know, people hid and did under, you know, it went underground and stuff like that for the, you know, during the Japanese occupation, right? And then, but then you ask Wanguk Lee, he's like, no, I went to Japan, I studied karate, I came back. It's like 60 years old. It was a very different history, right? Now, part of that reason is because, again, of that Japanese occupation. Especially early on, like a lot of people would call it Korean karate, and a lot of people would kind of get bent out of shape about that, right? So after World War II, when Korea became a nation again, there was a huge uprising in nationalism, right? There was a swell of patriotism and stuff like that, naturally so. And so it kind of makes sense that you would not want, for what was the longest time, basically your greatest cultural export, right? If you're a proud Korean, you know, you didn't want to acknowledge that your greatest cultural export was really Japanese karate, right? And so there was an emphasis to reach back into antiquity and focus on, again, the influence of Taekyon and kind of the more indigenous Korean martial heritage, which, I mean, Korea had a long martial history, right? But it just isn't very grounded in Taekwondo. And it's kind of weird. You see, like, I've heard various things around the ways because, again, instructors want to you know, do. I had one person that studied elsewhere, came to college, and was like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, my master told me, yeah, the Japanese kidnapped all the Taekwondo masters and took them to Japan and forced them to teach them how to do Taekwondo, and then that became karate. And that's why their forms look the same as our Taekwondo forms." Okay? Well, that's interesting because there's books published in Japan years before that with those forms in them. So they were clearly in Japan before that happened, right? Or, you know, Levi will tell you, you know, a lot of the forms are based in this eye pattern. We talk about our forms in our eye pattern, right? So I had one person tell me, "Oh, well, that's because you had to practice at night when you were during the occupation, and the traditional Korean house, the way you," I have no idea, I don't think this is true, the way the house is laid out, like the rooms in the hut or whatever, this is the way you had to walk in and like to move around so you didn't hit things, or, you know, the fireplace, so that they made the form look like that. Okay, again, there's evidence that karate was doing that form way before you had to go hide in underground in Korea or whatever else and stuff like that. So but again, you get some weird stories, but you can understand why they exist, right? So as Taekwondo has evolved, and again, really in some ways surpassed karate in popularity, because it as an Olympic sport and things like that, people have become a little more, how should we say, secure in, it has solidified itself as a legitimate martial art in its own right. People are nowadays a little more willing to acknowledge the Japanese karate influence on Taekwondo. But again, there is still this Taekyon aspect that led to more of an emphasis on kicking, okay? One other aspect of this is, one person that's worth noting is Jun Ri. Is known as the father of American Taekwondo. Came to America in 1956, right? Is a Chung Kwan member. Is again the father of American Taekwondo. Was really the first to come and start teaching Americans. Teaches and had a lot of schools in Washington D.C. Actually, I don't know if it's still there, but last time I checked, actually had like taught senators in the Capitol building, like in the gym in the Capitol building, like senators, representatives. He had a class just for them or whatever. And watching them do it was not the most impressive Taekwondo, but he's down there. He was Tony Robbins, the motivational speaker, was a Jun Ri black belt, right? So like a lot of times, if you know, people pay thousands of dollars to go to Tony Robbins seminars, and then one of the things, like they would break boards, and it was, what's the barrier in your life that you're trying to get through? He's a motivational speaker. And you break boards to get that. That's a metaphor for the barrier in your life you're going to break through now and stuff like that. But again, so I kind of joke. It's like, people pay $1,000 for a weekend with Tony Robbins, and you basically get that as part of your tuition here, and you get to break boards and stuff, right? So, right, you guys get a deal. But again, he was named one of the more one of the top 100 immigrants in the United States in the 20th century for his influence and things like that. Okay. Now, so that's a little bit of the history. Let's talk about, and what we're going to do on each one of these arts is we're going to talk a little bit about the history, and then kind of go into the defining characteristics, and then talk a little bit about the rules of the sport if we're not too familiar with that. Okay, if there's a sport. Okay, so characteristics, we already kind of talked about it. The majority of it is kicking. Okay, and that is again the difference. And if you look at a lot of the old Shotokan forms, right, they don't have a lot of kicking in them, but then you see it in the sparring and the other aspects. Okay. More particularly, a lot of jump, high aerial kicking, a lot of acrobatic kicking, compared to not just, kicking to the head is one thing, but jumping, spinning kicks and stuff like that. There's now even kind of a offset of that. You can YouTube Red Bull Kick It. This is where the guys are jumping and spinning and kicking, doing 940s and kicking a million times and stuff like that. The Kukiwan demonstration team does a ton of this too, right? Some of the, again, amazing athleticism, gymnastics meets martial arts, like tons of kicking and stuff like that, right? So the trick kicking, right, is not very traditional martial arts, but it goes to show again kind of how again, more than just your basic kicking, Taekwondo is gone, right? And so, but again, a lot of high kicking, a lot of spinning kicking, stuff like that. We still practice by forms. You would know the term is kata from karate, right? Basic sequences and training. There's one-step sparring, someone punches you, how to do it, get out of the way and stuff like that, okay? But then, again, there is the emphasis on kicking in the sport. Now, Taekwondo kicking is very much about speed. Okay? And now speed is one of the components of having good power, right? Momentum is mass times velocity, right? So we're looking at the velocity aspect of it, right? And so you gotta appreciate the speed at which, so they're kicking super fast, and there's something to be said for that, if you get to that level, as we talked about last week, the challenge is, can you get to that level, or how easy is it to get to that level, right? But if you're a high level Taekwondo athlete and people are like, well, it's kind of dangerous to kick to the head or whatever else, but yeah, but if I can do it faster than you can react, then works pretty good, right? And those guys, again, those guys are kicking faster, right, than most of you guys can move or react, right? So that being said, or having said that, then I typically don't really want to stand and try to block that when it's coming so fast at me, right? So a lot of the sport of Taekwondo, not about blocking, much more about trying to evade, right? And get out of the way. Because that kick is coming really, really fast. Right? So the sport of Taekwondo is much more, the emphasis is on evasive footwork, getting out of the way of the kicks, and then counter kicking, and staying in a much longer range than staying in and punching or blocking with the hands and staying closer. Right? So it's a much more longer range art. Now, the art, the sport is, like a lot of things, is evolving, is changing, and as we talked about before, it kind of last week, sometimes the sport really kind of distorts technique. In an emphasis to make the sport more exciting, they are incentivizing the headshots, right? People like offense. They change they change rules in other sports in the NFL to make it easier for people to score touchdowns. People don't want to see a 6-3 football game. People want to see a 27-20 football game, right? Defense is boring for a lot of people. So they're trying, for television and everything else, then they're trying, the sport is incentivizing more scoring. They're giving more points for headshots and things like that. Supposedly the more highlight kicks, right? So there's more of an emphasis on that in like the Olympic level. But so we're starting to lose some more of the good, solid martial arts foundations of the sport as that is happening. But so there are lots of variations in the rules, but generally speaking, right, you are not allowed to kick below the belt. Right, the target area is from the torso to the shoulders, not the top of the shoulders, front and sides of the body. You're not allowed to kick or punch along the spine. Okay, so torso and up. You are allowed to kick the head, but you are not allowed to punch the face. Okay? So again, the scoring area is front and sides of the body, either punching or kicking. People would bemoan the fact that they don't credit, you gotta have a picture perfect posterizing punch to score. A lot of punches don't get the credit they probably deserve. They're trying to re-emphasize the punching aspect of it, right? But again, you have to score to kick to the body or a kick to the head. You can score with a punch to the body. You're not allowed to punch to the head, okay? Again, you get various points. Kicks to the head are worth more. Spinning or fancier kicks are worth even more points than the standard shots. At the basic level, like what we do, there are more teaching tournaments. They are, the contact is light. You can kind of get disqualified for having excessive contact or whatever. But when we're talking about the more elite levels, if we're talking about international competition or whatever, it's full contact. You're trying to knock the other person out it's an automatic victory. Okay, if you kick them upside the head and knock them out. Okay, but that's, you know, most kids and people don't want kids kicked in the head, whatever, you know. So they it's a little more soft in that regard. Okay, all right. So again, some of you are familiar with Taekwondo, either seen it or done it. Okay. Let's look at a couple of other kicking arts from other places. So the next one we're going to look at is savate. Savate is basically French kickboxing. Okay. It basically is slang for boot. Okay. The history is rather sketchy. Some people speculate that French sailors brought kicking back from trips to Asia, although one would argue that like some of the kicking almost predates that. Chausson refers to the crescent kicks or the high kicks that started showing up in street fights and sailor brawls, right? You know, Paris nowadays, you know, is art and, you know, wine and whatever, you know, Eiffel Tower, whatever else, right? But, you know, there's a time when they were pretty violent cities, right? So what's pretty unique whereas like in England and every place else, boxing, you know, came in a little more emphasis on punching. Kicking kind of became a staple of the street fights in France. And again, it is speculated that it was because of sailors who brought it back. What's unique about savate is the more traditional savate. Basically, the idea was that, you know, if you were on a ship that was lurching and stuff like that, right, you kind of had to hold on to things, right? So you didn't fall off the ship. So they would hold on to ropes and stuff and they would kick. Now if I kick it, like it's hard to kick with one leg up in the air if the boat is rocking, you don't want to fall overboard or whatever. But again, they would hold on to ropes and stuff like that, and then they would kick, right? So it is speculated that there was that, okay? A lot of the original savate masters were also fencing masters, okay? So what is also rather unique about savate is that they kind of have a very fencing feel to their art. So we'll talk more about that when we get into the characteristics, okay? But, we'll kind of blur here. So, whereas like a lot of arts, we'll either keep our hands up as we kick,